She stood frozen beneath the grand chandeliers, her trembling hands clutching the delicate white lace of her gown. The music had stopped, and in its absence, a suffocating silence spread across the glittering hall. The whispers, once soft and discreet, now rippled through the air like fire consuming dry wood, louder and more insistent with every second. All eyes, which only moments ago had been fixed adoringly on the bride and groom, on the millionaire's wedding with its polished perfection and opulent display, had shifted elsewhere. They now rested upon a single figure, a woman who stood timidly at the side of the hall. She wore no silk, no satin, no glimmering pearls that reflected the golden lights above. Instead, she was clothed in a simple black and white maid's uniform, plain, unremarkable, and unfit for such a grand occasion, except for one detail that could not be hidden, the curve of her belly, round and heavy, revealing the truth of her pregnancy. The bride, Isabella, had been the one to call her forward, her voice sharp and commanding, cutting through the air like the crack of breaking glass. There was no kindness in her tone, no gesture of grace in her demand. She wanted the maid, Grace, as she was known within the household, to step into the spotlight, stripped of invisibility and anonymity. A cruel smile tugged at Isabella's lips as she issued her order, and her eyes glittered with the malicious satisfaction of someone who believed she had engineered the perfect humiliation. Before everyone, she forced Grace to sing, not as an honor, not as a gift, but as a spectacle meant to belittle, to strip away whatever fragile dignity the pregnant maid still carried within her heart. Yet what happened in those next moments would unravel far more than Isabella had ever anticipated. It would expose truths long buried, crack open pride that had been paraded like jewels, and leave even the coldest guest in tears. Grace had served in Isabella's household for years, often unnoticed, always silent. She moved like a shadow through marble corridors, polishing glassware until it gleamed, sweeping floors that would never remember her touch, serving meals without ever being acknowledged. She had been invisible, the kind of person no one paused to ask about, no one cared to wonder what she dreamed of or carried in her soul. To the family, she was simply the maid, the woman who smiled politely, bowed when spoken to, and kept her place. But Grace had not always been just that. Once, she had lived with dreams bright and alive, dreams of music and light. She had sung in a small church choir, her voice rising with such purity that it seemed to pierce through the stained glass windows themselves, drawing people in with its warmth and power. Those who heard her used to whisper that her voice could move even the hardest of hearts. But life is not kind to every dreamer. Poverty, betrayal, and the merciless blows of survival had chipped away at her once radiant hope until all that remained was endurance. Her pregnancy was not a story of love but of heartbreak, for the father of her child had vanished, leaving her alone to navigate a world where even survival was uncertain. And so she worked, carrying not only the weight of her unborn child but also the relentless sting of humiliation, the piercing judgment of those who believed she was lesser, and the unspoken knowledge that she lived perpetually on the edge of being discarded. Isabella, the bride, lived at the opposite end of this spectrum. Born into wealth, draped in privilege, adorned with beauty, and fed with opportunity, she had everything Grace had been denied. Yet beneath her polished smile lay something far darker, envy and insecurity, always simmering just below the surface. On her wedding day, dressed in a gown worth more than what most families earned in a year, she should have radiated joy. Instead, she radiated control. Her heart set not on celebration but domination. When her gaze landed on Grace at the back of the hall, standing quietly as though trying to disappear into the walls, Isabella saw not just a servant but a reminder of imperfection, an unpolished shadow that had no place in her carefully curated fairy tale. And so she did what only cruelty would devise. She pulled Grace into the very center of the hall, demanded that she sing before the guests, and dressed her humiliation as entertainment. The guests, glittering in jewels and gowns, shifted in their seats. Some looked away, ashamed but unwilling to speak, unwilling to risk the wrath of their wealthy hostess. Others whispered behind their hands, waiting for awkwardness to unravel, perhaps even for laughter to break the tension. Grace, however, felt her entire body quake under the weight of their stares. Heat rushed to her face, humiliation tightening its grip around her throat. Her secret, the voice that had once been her refuge, her sanctuary, was being stripped from her, transformed into a weapon to pierce her dignity. She wanted nothing more than to disappear, to dissolve into the polished marble floor beneath her feet. But as she stood there trembling, her gaze fell to her round belly, and a new thought rose within her like a flicker of flame against the night. Inside her grew a child, an innocent life who one day would look to her and ask what kind of mother she had been. Would she be the kind of woman who bowed her head, accepted cruelty, and carried shame in silence? Or would she be the kind who lifted her chin, who stood unbroken, who showed her child what it meant to rise above even when the world tried to crush you? With that thought, Grace closed her eyes and drew in a trembling breath. For a moment, silence reigned, as if the hall itself held its breath with her. Then came the first note, soft, uncertain, quivering like the flutter of a bird's wings. And yet, the sound carried, reaching into the corners of the grand hall and silencing the whispers in an instant. Then, as though something ancient and unbreakable awakened within her, her voice grew stronger, steadier, each note richer than the last. The hall, filled with chandeliers, marble, and wealth, now reverberated not with music designed to flatter or impress, but with something raw and soul-stirring. It was not the voice of a maid. It was not the voice of someone meant to live in shadows. It was a voice that rose above humiliation, above cruelty, above the cruel spectacle Isabella had tried to make of her. It was the voice of a woman who carried the weight of pain, yet still managed to shape beauty from the depths of it. Her song was not polished or rehearsed, but raw, trembling with truth, soaked in emotion so deep that it could not be ignored. The hall, once filled with whispers and judgment, fell into absolute stillness. Guests seemed to stop breathing, their eyes widening as tears welled up unbidden, softening the same gazes that only moments ago had looked upon her with disdain. Even the chandeliers above appeared to shimmer differently, as if her voice had transformed the very air, wrapping the grand room in something sacred and unearthly. Grace was no longer just a maid, no longer a shadow in the background of wealth and privilege. In that moment, she was a vessel of something greater, her voice carrying both agony and resilience, despair and hope, breaking hearts open with every note. And then it happened. From his seat at the head of the hall, the millionaire groom, Alexander, rose to his feet. Unlike the others who shifted uncomfortably or wiped discreet tears, his eyes had not moved from Grace since the instant her first note trembled into existence. There was recognition in his gaze, as though her voice had reached into the deepest corners of his memory and pulled something long buried back into the light. Slowly, with deliberate steps that echoed through the hushed hall, he walked toward her. The silence was so complete that each footstep sounded like a drumbeat against marble. When he reached her trembling figure, he did something that no one, least of all Isabella, the bride, could have predicted. He took Grace's shaking hands into his own, bowed his head, and let his tears fall freely in front of the entire assembly. The bride froze where she stood, her painted smile shattering, her heart lurching with fury. This was her day, her stage, the performance of her perfect life. Yet here was her groom, the man she believed belonged entirely to her, falling to pieces before another woman. And not just any woman, but the maid, the servant, the very figure she had dragged into the spotlight to humiliate. Isabella's lips curled with rage as she hissed his name, her voice sharp with command, but Alexander did not move. His gaze remained fixed on Grace, unblinking, reverent. He raised his head slightly, his voice trembling but clear enough for the nearest guests to hear, words that would soon ripple across the room. "You saved me once with that voice." Gasps spread like wildfire through the guests, confusion flashing across their faces. Grace's brow furrowed, not understanding what he meant. What no one knew, not even Grace herself, was that years ago, when Alexander had been at his lowest, broken beneath the weight of despair and uncertainty, he had stumbled late one night into a dimly lit church. He had been lost, standing at the edge of decisions that might have ended his life. And in that silence, in that moment of darkness, he had heard a voice. A voice that rose steady and pure, him filled with hope unshaken, threading through the stained glass shadows. That voice had wrapped around him like a lifeline, pulling him back from the abyss that he had not seen her face, only the silhouette of a young woman singing beneath the glow of candlelight. But that voice had saved him. That voice had been Grace's. Now, as he stood before her, the recognition surged through him like fire. His knees buckled beneath the weight of it, and before anyone could stop him, Alexander dropped to the polished floor in front of Grace. A ripple of shock spread through the hall as he reached out, his hand trembling, and rested it gently on her rounded belly. Lifting his tear-stained face to hers, he spoke words that carried clearly, resonating across the stunned silence of the hall. "No one humiliates the woman who saved my life. Not today. Not ever." The weight of those words broke the room wide open. Whispers rose and then fell away into silence, and soon, a wave of emotion swept through every heart present. Some guests began to weep openly, others lowered their heads in shame for having judged her so harshly. Isabella's face twisted, her perfect composure unraveling into rage. This had been her triumph, her wedding, her chance to wield her power, and instead it had all collapsed. Her attempt to humiliate Grace had backfired so completely that it was she who now stood exposed, her cruelty laid bare before the very people she had sought to impress. No amount of wealth, beauty, or polished charm could erase what had just unfolded. Grace, the maid she had sought to shame, had become the center of the night, not through scandal or humiliation, but through the undeniable truth of her voice and the reverence of the man Isabella had believed was hers alone. Instead of being broken by humiliation, Grace was now lifted higher than anyone in that hall could have ever imagined. Alexander turned to the stunned crowd, his voice steady and filled with conviction, and declared that Grace would never again live as a maid, never again be treated as a shadow in someone else's story. Before the glittering guests, before the bride whose cruelty had orchestrated this moment, he promised her a future of dignity, security, and reverence. He vowed that her voice, this gift that had once saved his life and had just transformed the hall, would be celebrated, not mocked. The words hung in the air like thunder. Transformed the hall, would be celebrated, not mocked. The words hung in the air like thunder, shaking the very foundation of what the day had been meant to symbolize. Gasps turned to murmurs, murmurs turned to applause, and soon some guests were crying openly, unable to contain the flood of emotion that Grace's courage had awakened in them. Grace, however, stood frozen, trembling in disbelief as the magnitude of it all settled into her heart. For so long she had been invisible, her life reduced to servitude, her identity buried beneath trays and mops and quiet smiles. Yet now, in this moment, she was not seen as a servant, nor as a burden to be pitied, but as a woman whose worth was undeniable. Tears slid down her cheeks as she realized that this recognition, this sudden shift in how the world saw her, was not born of wealth, beauty, or power, but of truth, the truth of her song, the truth of her spirit. The wedding, once staged to be Isabella's flawless dream, had instead unraveled into something far greater than anyone had expected. What was meant to showcase power and prestige became a lesson carved into the hearts of all who witnessed it. Pride and cruelty may glitter in lace and diamonds, but they can never shine brighter than humility and truth. Isabella's cruelty had sought to reduce Grace to nothing, yet it was Grace's unwillingness to surrender her voice, her quiet bravery in the face of shame, that became the light of the day. Her song, forced from her lips as an act of humiliation, became the very act that set her free. As the afternoon sun streamed through the tall arched windows of the hall, its golden rays fell across Grace's tear-streaked face, illuminating her as though the heavens themselves bore witness to her transformation. In that glow, she felt the weight on her shoulders begin to lift. For the first time in years, hope surged through her chest, not as a fragile dream but as a living promise. She realized that life had given her a second chance. Her unborn child would not grow up watching a mother bent under shame and silence, but one who had stood tall even when the world tried to crush her spirit. Her child would know resilience, would know dignity, and would know that their mother had faced cruelty and risen above it. Alexander's hand still rested gently on her belly, his gaze steady and filled with reverence, as though he understood the enormity of what she carried, not just the life within her, but the strength of every battle she had fought alone. In his eyes, she was no longer a servant moving unnoticed in shadows, but the most important person in the world. Grace wiped her tears slowly, pressing her palm to her stomach, and whispered silently to the child she carried, promising them a life where they would never inherit shame, only the strength of truth. The millionaire's declaration had stunned the guests into silence, but for Grace, it was far more than spectacle or shock. It was proof that even in the darkest of moments, light has a way of breaking through, and that sometimes, the voice you believed silenced forever is the very voice that saves not only others, but yourself.